thank you all for inviting me. It's really nice to be here in Stockholm. And so what I'm going to talk about today is a paper that I've called The Socio-Environmental State Towards a Political Ecology of State Formation and Environmental Change. And this really comes from, actually this paper was quite fun to do because it's the first time in what feels like about 5 years that I've actually sat down and written a single authored paper that was about things that I was really thinking about and were my passions and old literatures as well as new literatures that I've been engaging with. All the other things I've been publishing recently have mostly been co-authored and sort of for specific purposes. So actually carving out the time to finish this paper was a challenge, and it was originally drafted in 2010, and I submitted it last autumn, or 2011 rather, and I submitted it last autumn, so it's under review now. But what I want to do today is try to make an argument about state formation from a kind of political ecology or socio-nature perspective. I'm not going to make a big distinction between socio-nature and political ecology, but if anybody wants to ask me about that, I can certainly speak to that at the end. Okay, so at the moment, there's a lot of concern about climate change and food security, lots of these big so-called global environmental challenges. And these questions raise some very prickly issues about who is responsible for governing the environment and whose priorities should be privileged. And probably most importantly, what role the state should play. So lots of discussions about whether or not it should be sort of non-governmental actors, super-governmental actors that are governing, say, UN bodies, governing the environment. But despite all this proliferation of international agreements, investment in carbon by both private and sort of state-like or kind of quasi-state institutions, the state continues to be in the spotlight. In most places, states continue to retain statutory authority over their resources and their lands, for example. Here in the EU, it's nation states that are responsible for implementing EU directives, etc. So I want to sort of think a little bit about if we kind of look at this through this kind of lens of environmental governance, what does that tell us about what the state is and how it operates? And perhaps most importantly, how resources and their nature or their kind of material qualities shape the possibilities for state transformation, not only ecologically but also politically. And so that's what I'm calling the socio-environmental state. And I actually have a specific reason for not calling this like the socio-natural state, which might be something very hip and current in geography. And that's partly wanting to speak to a wider audience. And people who might not be engaged in socio-nature debates have no idea what that means. Whereas if I talk about the socio-environmental state, they maybe get it a little bit more easily. So it's kind of more pragmatic than semantic than anything else. So my core argument today is that there's far more at stake than simply environmental governance when we ask who is responsible for governing the environment. But rather, this moment of governing resources is absolutely foundational to the transformations of states, materially, symbolically, politically. So it's not only that states govern resources with particular consequences for environmental change or for sustainability, but that the act of governing resources is this crucial moment of state reproduction or state transformation. And so I'm going to begin with two kind of core premises, and I think we can distill this out of a lot of the existing literatures. And one is that questions of citizenship, belonging, and distributive justice are contested and established within environmental governance contexts. So it's and actually in many places, like as political ecologists have shown us, it's a key moment of these contestations over citizenship and belonging. Secondly, and this is maybe more of my own contribution here, that environmental change is a partial, albeit non-determinant driver of fragile state politics. And it's this last part of the argument that I want to try. Well, I'm going to build both parts of the argument, but maybe a little bit more in the second. And so I'm going to speak to you through the work that I've done in Nepal. I've worked in Nepal for 25 years. Most people don't think I'm old enough to have worked in Nepal for 25 years, but it's true. I started out as an undergraduate there, to be fair. And I initially worked on community forestry and questions of social belonging like gender and caste. I'm probably best known as a feminist political ecologist, actually. And so I'm going to use this kind of long-term work, especially in the forestry sector, to think through this idea of the environmental state, socio-environmental state. So Nepal is a really great place to look at this because it's long been the target of global conservation efforts. In the 1970s, it was declared that the hillsides of Nepal would be completely deforested by the millennium, and that this was going to cause catastrophic flooding downstream, in particularly Bangladesh and India. And so as a consequence, a number of kind of programs began in particularly the forestry sector, conservation in general, but forestry being at the forefront. And these programs, and specifically community forestry, have kind of emerged as models of best practices participatory development globally. And people who are interested in community forestry, trying to implement participatory resource governance, will go to Nepal in order to learn how to do it right. I'm not saying it is right, but it is sort of seen as a success story. And at the moment, there's kind of, all the donors are kind of running around trying to frantically rebrand themselves as doing work on climate change. Because now this kind of narrative of crisis in the Himalayas is sort of manifesting around climate change. So at the moment, there's severe environmental change projected for the Himalayas, and this is not something that I contest. I've just come back from the field and heard a lot of narratives of changes in water resources, increases in pests, movement of various species of agricultural crops or forest species from one elevation to another. You know, areas that have successfully grown oranges for a long time now not being able to, and the oranges moving further up the mountain, for example, the apples as well. So I think that these kind of notions that severe environmental change will occur in the Himalayas is probably quite accurate. The Himalayas are sort of known as the third pole. It's considered one of the kind of climate change hotspots of the world, and that changes in that region are expected to have global impacts on the scale of what will happen with polar changes in terms of melting of ice, etc. But Nepal is also a polity in transition. I'm not sure how many of you know that Nepal has just, well, actually it's not just anymore, but it's relatively recently recovering from the Civil War. I met people, I was there during the war, and I met people on the plane telling me they were going trekking in Nepal because it was so peaceful. And I said, you do know there's a civil war going on, don't you? So yeah, some people don't realize. There was a 10-year-long Maoist insurgency. It was called the Maoist People's War. They succeeded in 2006 in overthrowing the monarchy and forming a government. There were elections in 2008 for this constituent assembly process. And after missing 3 deadlines to finish the Constitution, in May 2012, it was disbanded and nothing was put in place. Now, in some ways, that vacuum is part of my interest here. You know, there's a way in which I have to explain why something that's recognizably the Nepali state continued to be visible and function during this period between May 2012 and November 2013, when technically there was no government at all in Nepal. And the Supreme Court continued to govern, civil bureaucracy continued to function, political party leaders continued to try to claim for the right to govern. But it has sort of thrown into relief for me processes which are at work everywhere else in the world, but when they are so unstable and so contested, we kind of see them thrown up in our face a little bit more clearly. Okay, so conceptually, the way that I've kind of put together this idea of a socio-environmental state comes from several different literatures here. First of all, I build from work in political science on governmentality and neoliberalism. I'm not going to spend much time at all talking about neoliberalism, but I can explain the link there if you like. In geography, a lot of this work has sort of been manifested in interest in the networked relations through which governance is achieved, as well as some of Joe Painter's work on the production of territory. I'll come back to each one of these points. In anthropology, looking at the multi-sided nature of authority and sort of governing relations that need to be continually renewed. And finally, in political ecology, some of these technologies for controlling populations and governing resources. And so really what we're interested in here is not only how the legitimacy to govern is produced, but also how it is durable over time and space by certain actors and certain institutions. And I think that's quite important because a lot of the work on state formation kind of is interested in how the state comes into being and kind of forgets to tell us how it remains. And again, in that Nepal context of no elected government, how did the state continue to govern? So to kind of go through each one of these one by one, I think, first of all, we're seeing, there's been a lot of concern in the literature on what I kind of sort of call the Ngo Ization of governance, okay, or these new forms of governing at a distance. And that's where some of this work from political science is important. And looking at this moment that we seem to be going through where it's no longer necessary for the state to be present, but the state develops certain technologies or rules whereby people self-govern, okay, and that the state can sort of have its influence or be the directing hand from a distance. Secondly, we see a lot of new actors being authorized to govern and control resources, and in particular international players. Now, in Nepal, there's a very interesting example of this, where the donors needed an institution through which to implement climate change programs at the local level. And so they created an entirely new body that they call VFCCs, or Village Development Committee Forestry, what is it? It's Village Development Committee Forestry something something, but it's linked to the Village Development Committee level. And these VFCCs are intended to bring together people from different sectors, so from the water sector, from the agriculture sector, etc., in order to do climate adaptation programs. And these institutions don't exist within the sort of state structure of Nepal. And yet international actors are able to kind of construct bodies at the local level on the ground in Nepal to do these things. And some of them are up and running and managing programs and being given resources. And this is quite important. They're given money to do stuff. And so this is sort of one of the ways in which the kind of locus of governance seems to be shifting from the state into this sort of whole variety of different actors that are kind of doing state-like functions. And this is something that we need to pay attention to. And certainly in Nepal, another kind of manifestation of this are the ubiquitous users groups and service providers. Okay, so for almost everything now, the success of various participatory development schemes in Nepal mean that users groups are seen as the solution. You're going to build a new road? Well, get some user groups all along the way and they'll look after it and do its long-term maintenance. And service providers are basically, in my view, is probably the most successful dimension of development in Nepal, in the sense that what they do is they employ local people or local groups, usually formed through an NGO, to deliver development services. So they'll be the ones that will go in and implement a new climate adaptation program, for example. So international staff don't do this. It's done through all these locally based service providers. And what this has done is it's provided jobs for educated young people at the, in rural areas in Nepal where there otherwise would be no jobs. So that's what I mean when I say that's sort of the success of development. But they basically go out and do development. And again, I think this is one of the ways in which we see them sort of promoting a variety of ways of governing resources, of interacting with the state, of being important mediaries between local authorities and local people. So this work on this kind of landscape of neoliberalism and the diffusion of governing at a distance has raised questions for a lot of anthropologists about the nature of public authority. And in particular, they've sort of emphasized this multi-sided nature of the state, that the state itself is not one coherent entity, but rather what the state, who the state is and what it does is sort of the outcome of lots and lots of everyday activities of civil bureaucrats at different levels. And so our attention, if we're interested in public authority, needs to be on who is it that's governing and what is it that they're doing when they're governing. And indeed, in the South Asian context in particular, Jonathan Spencer has drawn our attention to some of the violent and sometimes absurd ways in which authority is claimed and reproduced. And he uses an example of a local politician sort of literally taking off his trousers and running around in his underwear after the elections, part of the celebration. And he's saying, look, that's not something that's happening outside of the sphere of formal politics, but rather it is precisely in those performances that politics itself is being done. And this is how these kinds of moments of belonging and sense of what the state is and what the state should provide for you or who the state might be is kind of being manifest. Okay, so when we take some of this stuff and we think about, if we kind of say, okay, we've got this multi-sided locus of authority, we need to pay attention to the everyday practices through which governing takes place, but it's not actually that people are just passive recipients of authority, that they sort of take on whatever governing they're supposed to do. But rather, I use an idea of political subjectivity to capture how power operates to produce desires for recognition, belonging, and rights. And this is terribly important in Nepal at the moment. I mean, people are fighting over who belongs in the state, and they're fighting over specifically cultural recognition. So, is the name of my ethnic group written in the Constitution? Okay, or is it enough to put indigenous peoples, for example? And that's been an ongoing battle. And you see various sorts of groups coming together and lobbying and then splitting apart again, etc. But this idea that actually political subjectivity kind of helped to shape both citizenship as well as wider dimensions of inclusion and exclusion in the state. So one of the points I want to make here for those of you who are interested in some of the debates in political geography is that in political geography, especially feminist geography, they tend to conflate political subjectivity and citizenship. So they've expanded the notion of citizenship to be about these moments of recognition and various dimensions of inclusion and exclusion. But I feel like when we hold political subjectivity separate from citizenship, we can see these contradictions between formal citizenship and contexts wherein political subjectivities might be contested or produced. So to give you an example, it may be that as a citizen of Nepal, I have rights to forest resources, but in practice, in the user group, because of who I am, I'm excluded from those resources. And it's important to recognize that it's not that my citizenship rights have been taken away. The legal basis is still there, and there are still channels through which I might attempt to claim those rights, but that in practice, my political subjectivity is such that I'm unable to exercise those rights. Okay, and I think, again, in feminist geography, they've been trying to capture this by sort of embracing all of that under the rubric of citizenship, but I'd quite like to hold those separate for my purposes here. Okay, sorry, a lot of theory, but we'll get there. So, I feel like what this literature does is it brings us into an understanding of this multi-sided nature of authority, of the ways in which political subjectivities are created and contested, and what it tends to lack is adequate attention to material resources and how they are crucial in this production of authority. And so a couple of people have started to rectify this. Out of geography, we get Joe Painter's work looking at territory as effect. So Joe Painter has sort of argued that territories are the outcome of networked socio-technical processes. So they aren't pre-existing entities, but rather they emerge through the relationships. And in particular, he's looked at, like in the UK, with this devolution of governance to local levels, what happens when you sort of devolve certain kinds of resources without devolving other resources, and then the kinds of institutions that get constituted within those spaces that then end up functioning as a region. Okay, and again, those of you who are into geography debates, this is sort of contra some of the work on regionalism that would have been done in the mid-20th century, where regions were assumed to pre-exist. This idea of territory as effect comes from Mitchell, Timothy Mitchell, who's a political scientist that wrote a very short and extremely influential article about the state as effect. And what Mitchell's argument is that one of the achievements of states is that they seem to be separate from society. So it isn't that the state is somehow separate from other social relations and other social processes, but that the state itself becomes visible, becomes legible, as it serves to distinguish itself from the rest of society. And so we have to, when we're interested in understanding the state and state formation, we need to look at these moments and practices wherein that separation from the rest of society is achieved. And again, I think in Nepal right now, this is really important as the political transition is sort of highlighted lots of slippery areas between who might be the state, what the state is doing, and what so-called civil society is doing, etc. Now, also to sort of bring back in the non-humans a bit more, some other work in, I suppose, Christian Lund and Thomas Secor, Nancy Peluso, Jesse Rebo, none of whom I think actually have clear disciplinary homes. Certainly Jesse and Tomas were trained in these multidisciplinary departments at Berkeley. But they've been looking at the ways in which property rights are bound up in the production of authority and citizenship. So Lund's kind of core argument is that that moment of granting property rights is a kind of state effect. It's the moment at which the person granting the property rights is trying to sort of establish their authority. But that's not a one-way street. It requires the people accepting those property rights or acknowledging those property rights to also acknowledge that that person or institution has the authority to grant those property rights. And this debate has come out of, in particular, Western Africa, where a local authority is not that clear. You've got lots of different sorts of competition for authority at different levels. And so it is when we see these moments where somebody's giving you property rights, somebody else is acknowledging those property rights, that we can begin to see which sort of public authorities have any legitimacy. But for me, what's important here is that this argument shows us how property itself is important for authority and political subjectivities, and particularly in places where there's an apparent lack of state power. And we often see insurgent groups, for example, attempting to tax roads, grant property rights. The Maoists did this in Nepal. They tried to give property rights to landless people within forest areas, for example. And that became a crucial moment of them acting like a state, of gaining the legitimacy to govern. Okay, now, if we go into the political ecology literature, and I'm sorry, I recognize this is quite a complex argument. I did warn you it was the result of a lot of thinking on my part. It's probably a bad idea, but anyway, if we go into the political ecology literature, we again start to see the way in which territory and material resources are really important in this formation of states. And in particular, the people like Lund and Nancy Peluso have argued that citizenship and the territory of the state are constituted in relation to each other. So Nancy Peluso's work has shown us how in Indonesia, for example, different kinds of people, different ethnic groups, became associated with particular kinds of forest practices. And when violence erupted, those people were targeted as being either of the state or not of the state because of the forest practices that they were engaged in. And so one form of kind of resistance or self-protection was for people to do other kinds of forest practices. Okay, they didn't want to be associated with that ethnic group that was being branded as other. Now, I don't know, those of you who know Nancy Peluso's work, it's in Indonesia, and there's lots and lots of migratory groups that have come in to the Indonesian archipelago, and at different points in history, some of these migratory groups have been declared sort of no longer of the state, and the state has sought to expel them. Okay, and it's often, you know, people have been there for several generations, usually of Chinese origin, and many of these moments of expulsion were very, very violent. Okay, and her work on forests revealed these histories that had never been written about and had never been seen before. Because as she sought to understand the forest landscape and forest governance, it became clear to her that these political subjectivities, these cultural identities, and different practices in the forest were all so deeply embedded within each other. It was almost impossible to separate them. And that this was foundational to these imaginaries of the Indonesian state. Good Indonesian citizens do certain kinds of forest practices. Okay, those foreigners, they do that other kind of forest practices, so we need to get rid of them. And that's really, really crucial to my argument here, because it is this moment where it's not just that control over resources is a key mechanism for control over populations, because that's very true, but it also draws our attention to the ways in which citizenship and the territory of the state are constituted in relation to each other, rather than beginning with some preconceived spatial frame upon which social relations play out. So in some sense, the state itself doesn't exist until these relations come into being. Okay, finally, what I want to add here is just a little bit from the feminist political ecology work, which shows us the ways in which subjectivities are formed in relation to material resources. So political subjectivities become inscribed on the landscape as people comply with, modify, or resist authority. Okay, and I've seen this a lot in community forestry, where you have people decide that they don't need to do what the user group has said. And those moments of deciding become visible in the forest landscape. They've just cut trees where they weren't supposed to. They took their animals where they weren't supposed to go, or they lit a fire where there wasn't supposed to be a fire. And that fire will change the ecology of the forest for at least 10 years. You know, one instance of burning. So these kind of struggles over political subjectivities, which were almost always about political struggles in the village, they were almost never about the forest itself. The forest became the territory wherein they could exert some power or do something that made them feel like they weren't just being sort of squished by whoever was controlling these resource governance regimes. So, yeah. And then I think I also want to sort of make this argument that Loon doesn't really take us to. So Christian Loon's done this very important move in thinking about property rights and state formation. But I don't think it's accidental that it's property rights. This ability to secure resources or grant resources for livelihood security is absolutely foundational to the aspirations of both ordinary citizens and those who are seeking the authority to govern. So if you're going to become a valid state authority, you need to somehow secure the livelihood base of the people that you're governing. And also, if I want to feel like I'm a citizen in Nepal, I've got to feel like I have the resources I need to be able to fulfill my livelihood, sort of basic livelihood needs. So I think that it's not accidental that it's property. Okay, so let me now go into the Nepal story more clearly, which I think will be a relief to you. And just show you, because forests in Nepal are fascinating in the ways in which they have a very, very long history with sort of being bound up in public authority and the quest to govern the nation of Nepal. Dating back to at least the 18th century, the the idea that state authority was linked to control over forests was quite clearly established. The Rana oligarchy that ruled Nepal between 1851 and 1949 gave land grants to aristocrats and military leaders in order to secure their allegiance. And these land grants in particular, they gave the right to collect taxes from the peasantry, and also actually the need to collect taxes from the peasantry. But they also gave them control over forests and forest resources. And I have a document from 1918 from Western Nepal that sort of outlines the various practices through which the local land grantee was supposed to govern the forest. And they look surprisingly like modern community forestry rules. It's very interesting. A lot of concern over fire suppression, for example, not cutting green wood, things like that. Now in 1957, after a kind of failed democratic movement and the reestablishment of the monarchy, the king nationalized all the forests. And this has always been presented as a move to establish, or for forest conservation. So he was sort of supposedly in conversation with the FAO and various donors, and this was an idea that forests needed to be managed better. This could be true, but I actually think that it was his attempt at dispossessing this rural elite from most of their land. All land that had trees on it was declared national land. So it meant that this, dispersed authority, very powerful rural elite, suddenly lost half of its land base, half of its claims to governing and to rule. And it simultaneously extended the king's sovereignty into the farthest reaches of the country. So now that, forested land up on the, the Tibetan border way out in western Nepal belonged to the king. And the king's presence, in a way, came into that place. And very interestingly, where I worked in western Nepal by Rara Lake, which is really, really remote and was really remote then, the king came and visited in the 50s. And one of the local villagers tells me still remembers the suffering they went under to build the road that runs around the lake, which was designed for him to be able to tour around the lake. And all the villagers had to give voluntary labor for it. So these kind of imaginations of how the state ought to be and the political subjectivities, in other words, to belong to the nation, is to care for forests. And this has been long, long established. After the king was in his rule, this kind of proverb was put forward that Nepal's wealth is her green forest. Okay, and people still recite this to me all the time. And it's like but it was actually a slogan of the king's rule that one would sort of excluded. So, poor, Dalit, single women are probably the most excluded, and that would be the most vipanna in that area. But this sort of goal of good forest governance, I think, is one that hasn't died. And there's a number of people that continue to argue that actually there's not enough emphasis on forests themselves. But in terms of my argument here, the key thing is that community forestry is this incredibly powerful technology of rule. It's allowed the government to continue to govern without needing to actually control what's happening in everyday forest governance. That's being given over to local people. And it's actually manifest in a change in subjectivity. So good citizens of the state are ones who now care about forest protection and do a good job. And that was what that, Nepal's wealth is her green forest was about, but it didn't work because that was manifest within the forest department. It was always seen as a forest department thing. Now it's a community thing. This is our forest. It belongs to us, and we need to take care of it. And that narrative is incredibly strong. So while on the one hand, community forestry has been very, very successful, in another way, there is this Janus face of it. The state continues to own the land, but it no longer has to do the labor of governing it. User groups do that in a voluntary way. And also, as many others have pointed out, participation excludes some while including others. And there's absolutely no question that today community forestry takes on this routine performance. And I was just recently in the field and I found it really difficult because people kept wanting to bring together these focus groups and have everybody tell me what was happening with climate change. And I was like, no, that's not what I want, but they all knew how to do it. And one young woman actually got up there and started reciting all these changes like she was in school, like she remembered them all, and she was looking to me for approval. And it was so clear to me that she was just saying something she'd memorized that I was totally not listening after the first few lines of what she had to say. But also important for my argument here is the way that community forestry promotes these subjectivities of the good forest manager. And this has been so successful that at the moment, most professional foresters in Nepal reckon that forests are underutilized by about 30%, and that they would actually grow better if they harvested more. So this very strong narrative of governance. But to assume that this technology of rule has simply resulted in the transplantation of conservation subjects and good governance in the way that Arun Agarwal has formulated his idea of environmentality is to do a very significant disservice to the people of Nepal. They both resist and internalize this operation of power that happens within community forestry. And forestry, community forestry in particular, has been a crucial rallying point in the recent political changes. Notions of distributive justice were defined through, in particular, FECOFUN, which is a national level network of community forest user groups. And they promoted all across the hills of Nepal ideas of distributive justice, which included caste and gender equity, attention to class, attention to the rights to self-autonomy of user groups to govern their own resources, etc. And certainly the Maoists had a role in the promotion of these kinds of narratives, and interestingly enough, so have donors. This whole idea of social inclusion kind of came from the donors, but it's taken on its own meaning in the hills of Nepal. It isn't that people have simply sort of passively rolled over and sucked it all in. They've taken it in and reinterpreted it in their own ways. And it's been absolutely transformational to expectations about who should be included and how. And it's in this sense that I think that forestry has been important in a reframing of what the state is. And I did a whole bunch of interviews in 2007 and 2008, right after the revolution, on what was democracy. And everybody told me gender and caste equity, development, access to roads, access to resources, and access to education and health. That was democracy. And, what would we say in Sweden if we asked people what democracy is? Probably not that answer. So if we want to understand what the state is supposed to be, what the state is trying to be, and what people think the state should be in Nepal, we need to pay attention to these kind of narratives that emerge through these environmental governance contexts like community forestry. Now to go into my socio-nature argument more directly here, the material qualities of forests have been really important in terms of, oops, I've got a typo there, sorry. In terms of community forest and other governance mechanisms. Trees in Nepal, because the understory of forests have been burned for a long time, and I have data on this. I've actually cored trees that show that regular burning goes back at least 80 years in the area that I worked, the 100 years now. But these trees, the forests have been burned for a long time, so most of the standing tree species are fire tolerant. Now this is really important. Fire tolerant species tend to colonize easily. So when community forestry came in and started sort of curtailing different kinds of management or harvesting practices, it meant that all the trees grew back. Okay, a different ecosystem, they might not have grown back so successfully. So it isn't just simply that community forestry was this kind of social political technology that led to good forest management. it's also that nature here is a player in this process. You might not, and often in other places, in fact, they don't get the same kind of outcomes with community forestry. And part of it is ecological, not all of it, but part of it. The other way in which we see this is that the Forest Department has been very reluctant to implement community forestry in the lowlands or the Terai. This is a picture from the inner Terai. Mainly because the dominant tree species there is sal, which is a very valuable tropical hardwood species. And it commands very high prices on international timber markets, especially in India. So the Forest Department is not keen to sort of give away all its rights to managing this land and all the informal kickbacks it gets from the sale of timber. And so instead they created a different program called Collaborative Forest Management that doesn't give as much revenue to people and gives the Forest Department more control. But in terms of a socio-environmental state, what's so interesting here is that a number of indigenous communities from the Terai have claimed collaborative forest management as their own program. This is a program for them. And the reason for that is because Fecofood and the other network I mentioned has been so successful at promoting community forestry, they're seen as a hill program. That's for people in the hills. And the Terai is this contested space of migrants from the hills and so-called indigenous people struggling over resources, struggling over recognition by the state. And these indigenous groups see collaborative forestry as being for them. And so they've actually been advocating to have collaborative forestry implemented in their communities instead of community forestry. This is really important. They get 25% of the revenue instead of 90%. They're giving away livelihood security for recognition. And for recognition by some sort of sense of cultural identity. And it's precisely that recognition that they're looking for from the state right now. It's these areas, in fact, the Terai has been one of the most violent clashes post-2006 have happened in the Terai between so-called indigenous Terai groups and hill groups. And who has the right to that land, who has the right to be there, etc. Now, the other kind of way in which we see the importance of the materiality of forests was during the conflict itself. And I love this story, so I'm going to tell it to you, but I've got one more story after this. So the Maoists used the forests as a place to hide. And again, like guerrilla warfare is everywhere, this isn't very accidental. It's really easy to hide in a forest. It's really hard to hide on some grassy, dry hillside in western Nepal that's south-facing where no trees grow. Like, it's not a good place. You can be seen from a long way off. And because of the topography, you can be shot at from a long way off, too. So the Maoists moved around the country through forested landscapes. And they set up camps in the forest, and then they would go down into the village to demand donations and, hustle up support, etc. But the fact that their forest ecologies were conducive to guerrilla warfare is, I think, not the only reason why they colonized forests. Remember that the king had nationalized the forests. The forests are symbolic of the territory of the nation. If you can control the forest, you control the nation. And so I think it was also in part for this reason that the army sought to control forest resources. So in places where they went in, they most often set up their camps in forests and often cut them down. Actually, it was almost always community forests. And in part, I think that was because in some sense the state owned the land. They saw it as being governmental land, a legitimate place for them to be. But it also was this kind of recolonization of the space of the nation that was being contested by the Maoists. For villagers, this was extremely difficult. If you were caught in the forest by the army, you were at serious risk of being either arrested or shot as a Maoist, because it was Maoists who were in the forest, not villagers. And people in Nepal tend, in most places, still use the forest every day for livelihoods. They go in to get, they graze their animals, they get firewood, they need other sorts of supplies. It's mostly fodder and firewood on a day-to-day basis. and then also timber and leaf litter as inputs for their forests. So they need, or to their agricultural lands. So they need to go there. But villagers didn't take this lying down. And again, I think this is really important in terms of us understanding this kind of convergence of sovereign ambitions and political subjectivities. Villagers saw that they needed their forests, and so they entered into various kinds of negotiations with both the Maoists and the state, and or the government security forces, I should say. In some places, they had identity cards, and so they would go pick this up at the army post before they went into the forest. And then if they were found in the forest, they could show their identity card and say, no, we're community forestry members, we're getting firewood. In other places, I know of one instance where the village cut their forest down. The Maoists and the army had clashed in the forest a couple of times. After one Maoist attack, the army retaliated by killing 6 villagers. And so the villagers went in, they cut it all down, and they just stockpiled the timber. And they reckoned, well, that was kind of bad for us in the short term, but way better, or for us in the long term, but way better for us in the short term, and now they can't fight up there anymore. So there was a way in which the forest just became this totally contested space of, was it inside the nation, did it belong to the village, did it belong to the army, did it belong to the Maoists, and who was in the forest at what time and doing what was very important to how they were perceived. Because, you know, also, this is sort of another story, but also very importantly, a lot of times people would use community forestry user group membership as a neutral political identity. So they would be walking and they might meet some Maoists, and the Maoist members of the group would say, oh, no, they're fine, they're with us, we're part of the community forest committee. And if they ran into the army, the other people would say, no, they're one of our user group members, they're not a Maoist. And so it was kind of, even though they were Maoists, you know, it was used as this sort of neutral identity, this neutral place where people could sort of legitimately be traveling or doing business for the village under those auspices. Okay, so one final story here, and then I'll try to wrap up. Forests are again emerging as being very important in terms of belonging in this new Federal Republic of Nepal. I was trying to find a good good picture for this, and this was the best I came up with, which was, this is a big gate in Ilam district. Welcome to Limbuwan State. At the moment, there's a number of kind of federalist debates going on in Nepal, and how should the different parts of Nepal be linked to each other, and what should they be called? And the Maoists put forward the idea that they should be based on ethnicity, and this is kind of let the genie out of the bottle. So the Limbus are a particular ethnic group. Limbuwan means basically like state, so it would, Wan is similar to the word stan in Hindi. Like Pakistan would be the land of the Pakis. So Limbuwan is the land of the Limbus. And what's happened with this is that various groups, and especially in eastern Nepal, are trying to claim exclusive rights to forest resources on the basis of being indigenous to the area. This is really important because all of these areas are multi-ethnic. So the Limbus only number 40% of the population in the area that they want to be Limbuwan State. And they're using a variety of sorts of, mostly violence as far as I can figure out, but other sorts of coercive mechanisms to try to exclude other ethnic groups from using resources within those areas. So again, the territory of the state, the quality of forest resources, becomes bound up in these claims for belonging within the new Federal Republic. Another element of this is that we're seeing these alliances, which some people are calling the Iron Triangle. Somebody argued the other day it was an Iron Pentangle, of timber contractors getting into alliance with community forest user group presidents and district forest officers, and often political parties. This is where the pentangle starts to come together, in order to do a lot of illegal forest harvesting. There isn't a lot of oversight right now anywhere at any level of governance in Nepal. And the political instability is sort of opening up these spaces for different kinds of alliances and different sorts of contestations to emerge. And the landscape of the state is being transformed by this. And I think this sort of takes me quite nicely into my conclusion, which is that when we look at these environmental governance projects, they begin to reveal for us the workings of power. Okay, and they give us new insights into the workings of power than if we just looked at power itself. And so as these kinds of struggles over territory, political subjectivities, and authority take place, it transforms the landscape of the state, and that is going to change what's possible in the future. If you deforest half of the hillside, you're not going to just grow those trees back in 5 years' time. And this is what people are concerned about. Right now there's massive illegal timber cutting going on in the eastern border of Nepal, or the western border of Nepal, sorry. And it's going on through this triangle. It's going on through claims to governance. I'm the district forest officer, I'm here. But meanwhile, you don't have anybody sort of strong up in the national ministry to try to curtail any of these practices. But very importantly, as I've shown, I think that the materiality of resources reshapes the ambitions of managers. It's not possible to just decide what you're going to do, because the resources themselves might not cooperate that well. They might cooperate in some contexts better than others. And so it's in this sense that these socio-natures become kind of fundamental to some of the struggles that might emerge. And so just finally, I think that we see the way that nature shows us which kind of political subjectivities emerge, which struggles over resources, and which imaginaries of what the state is and what it ought to be comes into being. And I think this is important because a lot of people have been really nervous of an environmental determinist argument around this. Okay, this is not an environmental determinist argument. It's an argument that says that these networks, these relations, socio-natural relations, are just that. They're relational, they're contingent, they're emergent. But if we neglect the whole material side of it, we fail to understand how some of these processes of belonging and struggles over citizenship are constituting a particular kind of new republic in Nepal. Because what I see at the moment, just going back to the Nepal case study itself, is that people are saying, oh, the state's being unbuilt. Look at all the corruption. If just when there's elections, all the corruption will go away. And I'm like, I'm not so sure. I think what's happening is a mode of governing that's being cemented. And it's being cemented through this kind of iron triangle type relationships. And because it's bound up in resources, things that have value to them, financial value, capital value to them, they're particularly potent and powerful. Nobody's going to just decide that they don't get a kickback from that timber sale anymore because now there's been elections. So I think that these dynamics really shape the possibilities of what kind of future transformations can take place. They change the material landscape of the state, they change the political subjectivities that are there, and they change the technologies of rule, that all of which are not going to be undone very easily. Okay, I'll stop there.